Once again, I am being threatened by the Antichrist, but I've decided to set that aside for the time being to handle more pressing matters, namely that people are criticizing me on YouTube, which is completely unacceptable. So I released a video. It was actually an excerpt from a long interview I did with Ralph Stefan Weir about substance dualism, and I released this shorter clip about the interaction problem. It's all about like the history of the problem and how physicalists came to be so convinced of causal closure. And it's a good interview, it's a good video, but people get very upset when you say true things about substance dualism and the interaction problem, and it generated a Substack post and a video. So I wanted to respond to the video at least, because that's easy to do here on YouTube. And besides, reading is for nerds. We don't read. We're an anti-reading channel. This channel is all about being cool. It's not about reading. So I will link the Substack post anyway in the description. It's from Both Sides Brigade, and it's very good. But it's called Interacting with the Interaction Problem. But it's mostly about setting the prior probability of physicalism and why we should think the priors for physicalism, the prior probability of physicalism is high and that introspection is unreliable. But yeah, it's worth reading. So we are going to respond to this video from Monistic Idealism, who has a great channel, a lot of interesting stuff there. So do check it out. Let's see here. Through the Mist. We've got some people chiming in. Can we talk about how the Trinity makes absolutely no sense and how a nature and a person can be different? No, we cannot talk about that today. That is off topic, but it does make no sense. Anyway, oh yeah, there was a Trinity debate on Capturing Christianity with Jacob Hansen, the Latter-day Saint, and a Christian. Can't remember his name right now, but anyway, I actually don't have a lot of time, so I think I'm just going to restrict myself to the first part of this video. The last half is about an argument from Jonathan Schaeffer, mostly for monism, which is fine as far as it goes, but I think dualists have some ready responses to this first half. So yeah, let's dive into it.
Have you ever been in a sack race?
What does that have to do with anything?
Everything has to do with everything, Ryan.
In this video, I'm going to spell out what exactly the interaction problem is and why it is a fatal problem for substance dualism. I'm going to do this through a response to 3 people who have recently expressed skepticism regarding the interaction problem. And all 3 of them are people that I'm subscribed to and respect: Ralph Weir, Emerson Green, and Faith Because of Reason. I want to make clear that my intention is not to dunk on these people. They are all intelligent and philosophically informed, and I think they are actually correct in pointing out that the interaction problem has not been made clear enough and argued for sufficiently by many who wield this problem. So I'm taking this as an opportunity to make this problem clear and argue for it so we can all see why this is a fatal problem. I recommend anyone watching this to subscribe to these 3 people I'm responding to. I'll put links to their channels in the description of the video. I also want to give credit where it's due, and note how a lot of the quotes and points I make in this video come from the research of pessimistic idealism. I think anyone watching this should subscribe to his channel as well, which I will link along with his blog post that contains a lot of the quotes and points I bring up in this video. With that out of the way, let's begin.
I must say straight.
Okay, before we go into David Paulman's thing here, I did just want to say that monistic idealism is a friend of mine, and there's mutual respect here, but I do still think the interaction problem is basically a non-problem, and I'm going to explain why.
I bring up in this video. With that out of the way, let's begin.
I must say straight off that I have never understood why materialists have thought that the so-called interaction problem is such a decisive objection to substance dualism. This is primarily because of the fact that it is typically not all that clear what the problem is even supposed to be.
Like, explain to me, like I'm an idiot, what the interaction problem is. Like, explain to me why I'm supposed to reject dualism because the mind and the body can't interact, probably don't interact. Like, what exactly is the claim here?
The problem surely is not a straightforward logical contradiction, which would entail that substance dualism is false. So then, what is the problem? As stated in the aforementioned quotations, the problem appears to be little more than a question regarding how two different substances might interact. But how exactly is this supposed to be a problem? Even if the substance dualist has no idea how two different entities might interact, he can still know that two different entities interact.
The interaction problem isn't merely about how mind and body can interact. It's also about if mind and body actually can interact at all. I'm going to spell out in more detail what the problem is and how it is a defeater for interactionist substance dualism, but I'll start with a simple formulation, since that's what Emerson wants. I'll
Thank
work
you.
my way up to a more sophisticated formulation that makes things more clear. For the simple formulation, we can find one in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on dualism, which states, "A more general complaint often made against dualism is that interaction between mental and physical substances would involve a causal impossibility. Since the mind is, on the Cartesian model, immaterial and unextended, it can have no size, shape, location, mass, motion, or solidity. How then can minds act on bodies? What sort of mechanism or process could convey information of the sort bodily movement requires between ontologically autonomous realms? To suppose that non-physical minds can move bodies is like supposing that imaginary locomotives can pull real boxcars. Put differently, if mind-body interaction is possible, every voluntary action is akin to the paranormal power of telekinesis or mind over matter. If minds can, without spatial location, move bodies, why can my mind move immediately only one particular body and no others? That last question at the end is actually a really good question, but that's something I'll get to later. If we're just
Is that not a separate question? Like, if we're talking about the interaction problem on the one hand, like, at least as he's, framing it, like, how can these two very different things causally interact with each other? And then there's this other question. It seems like an additional question. Why is it that my soul is causally connected to my body, but no other body and no other matter? That seems like a question that you could ask a substance dualist, and it's one that, like, a property dualist wouldn't have to answer. So, yeah, that seems like it's an advantage of sorts, like, for the non-substance dualist. But it just seems like a problem that, I mean, I don't have a ready answer for it, but yeah, the anchoring problem or what have you. You know, like I said, I'm not sure I really have an answer to that, but it does seem like a separate problem, no?
we're just looking at a simple formulation of this problem, it's that on its face, it just doesn't seem to make sense that something non-spatial and non-temporal can somehow affect something spatial and temporal.
Well, consciousness, I mean, the soul would not be non-temporal. Like, obviously, consciousness is in time. Like, I have an experience at T1 and then another one at T2. So consciousness is in time, even if it's not, like, spatially located in the same way that my brain is spatially located. Actually, me and Humor talked about this because I was wondering, like, doesn't this imply something kind of radical about physics? Because you're saying that, those two things can be separated. Like, we have this immaterial soul that exists in time, but not in space. And he was happy to bite that bullet.
As we can see in these movie clips, this interaction problem is alive, not only in academia, but in the mind of the general public. A lot of people intuitively grasp that a ghost shouldn't be able to, quote unquote, touch the machine. So how could they interact? In strict logical terms, I get that not being able to answer how they interact doesn't mean they don't interact. But it seems to be the default view to many that they can't interact, and not having an answer as to how they interact does not increase our confidence that they can interact. If someone believes something like telekinesis is real, perhaps that's how this interaction could occur. But faith because of reason seems to be skeptical of psi phenomenon. And even if he wasn't, that naturally leads to the question from before. Why is it that my mind can only move my body, but not others? I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but a typical response I've heard from dualists is that it is my body and my mind. So the self sort of connects the mind and body. Though they are different, there's a composite unity of mind and body. If that's the approach the dualist wants to take, they will actually be falling into a trap. But that's something I will explain in more detail as I get into the sophisticated formulation of the interaction problem.
It is often assumed by physicalists that there is nothing problematic or difficult about understanding the mutual interactions between physical objects. But this is actually not as unproblematic as one might initially think. As Sandra Menson and Thomas Sullivan put it, admittedly, we have no idea how mind can move matter. But how big a problem is this? It could be monumental if it were not for one thing. In the end, we have no idea how matter moves matter. Despite what is sometimes said, we do not actually experience physical causality in any deep way. We see that matter moves matter in some sense, but we do not see why or how it happens. The interaction problem, then, to the extent that it is really a problem, applies equally to physicalism. We might just as easily ask the physicalist how it is that matter interacts with matter. It's certainly not immediately obvious what the answer to this question might be. The truth appears to be that any mystery involved in understanding how immaterial substances and material substances interact is not due to the fact that the entities consist in different substances. Rather, the mystery derives from the appeal to the very notion of causation, which is inherently somewhat mysterious.
I don't think faith because of reason is committing a fallacy here, but this response is a tu quoque. Accusing someone of having the same problem as you doesn't make the problem any easier to solve. It's just a whataboutism that suggests the monist has this problem too. He wants to put the blame on the mystery of causation, and so if monism is blameless, then dualism is also blameless. And this is where his fallacy comes in. Monism has an advantage because of the unity of the fundamental properties, which provides a much more straightforward story on causation, and this is an advantage dualism does not have.
See, I don't know if that's the best way to understand what he's saying is like oh, well, you're committing a fallacy because you're saying that, well, you have this problem too. I mean, this is part of why I don't like fallacies, because I think that there's like a good argument here, which is basically just like, look, causation is mysterious. Like, it's not like this is a unique problem for substance dualism. Causation in general is pretty weird and plausibly just basic or primitive, in which case it's not really it's not a problem for anybody, including substance dualists. And you can say like it's just like a kind of selective puzzlement about causation, where you say like, oh, well, causation and this like subset of causation, that's really weird and mysterious. It's like, well, what is uniquely weird and mysterious about this? And I don't think there's really a relevant difference. We're going to come to that here in a moment because he thinks there is a relevant difference. But again, I think dualists have a ready reply to his main issue here. But I wanted to take a moment to read a blog post. It's kind of a short section. Hang on, let me pull it up real quick. So I remember reading this a few years ago. This is from Majesty of Reason, Joe Schmid. And it's his blog post from 2019 about the interaction problem. And I recently asked him if he stood by this, and he said, yeah, pretty much. Just in case, because I shared it with one guy, and he said, well, this was written a while ago. Yeah, well, it makes sense what he's saying here, and this greatly affected me, and it kind of broke down my like a major resistance, to dualism. So I'm just going to read this section in full. To see why the interaction problem is not as mysterious as we might initially think, consider physical causation. What is physical causation? I aver that there is a deep mystery here, a mystery that parallels dualism's interaction problem. Just think about it. What is this mysterious relation of production, whereby one object or event causes another object, event, to exist or happen? How does that even occur? We can specify the shapes of the objects, their spatial contiguity, their color, their relative velocities, their kinetic and potential energy, and so on. But where is causality in this specification? In which of these facts does causation consist? To which of these facts could we point? We say that one billiard ball causes another billiard ball to move, but what is this relation of causation? It won't do to analyze it in terms of production, power, capacity, or generation, since these terms are themselves causal notions, and thereby presuppose the very thing to be analyzed. But if we make no reference to such causal notions, instead referring to wholly acausal facts, then it seems we haven't analyzed causation, but rather have eliminated it. For instance, we may analyze causation as constant conjunction, or spatial contiguity, or some other account, but arguably these accounts merely eliminate causation rather than illuminate its nature. We could analyze physical causation in terms of momentum transfer, but what is momentum transfer? Momentum is a quantity posited to account for conserved quantitative aspects of the causal effects of physical bodies on other physical bodies. If anything, momentum transference either presupposes a causal production of an effect, in which case it is not an illuminating analysis of causation, or it amounts merely to a constant conjunction in which a given quantity is conserved, in which case it seems to eliminate rather than illuminate the causal relation, which is one of the major problems afflicting Humean accounts of causation. But if physical causation is just as mysterious as non-physical to physical causation, it's unclear what the problem for dualism is. Indeed, arguably, causation is primitive, basic, irreducible, unanalyzable metaphysical feature of reality. Indeed, these difficulties in reducing, ontologically or conceptually, the causal relation are precisely what we would expect if the causal relation is primitive. In fact, there's widespread consensus that causal reductionist theories do not succeed. As two foremost experts on causation point out, after surveying the literature in some depth, we conclude that as yet there is no reasonably successful reduction of the causal relation, and correspondingly, there is no reasonably successful conceptual analysis of a philosophical causal concept. No extant approach seems able to incorporate all of our desiderata. I always read that word, I've never said it out loud. Desiderata for the causal relation, nor to capture the wide range of our causal judgments and applications of our causal concept. The prospects of a relatively simple, elegant, and intuitively attractive unified theory of causation, whether ontological reduction or conceptual analysis, are dim. So it seems we have some reason to be primitivists about causation. But if that's true, then physical to physical causation seems to be every bit as mysterious as non-physical physical causation. Under such an account, both are equally primitive, irreducible, and basic. A final note in relation to the interaction problem concerns the very nature of how questions. Usually when we pose a how question, we seek a mechanistic explanation of how one phenomenon gives rise to or interacts with another phenomenon. But by definition, the immaterial mind is not some mechanistic thing with parts arranged and operating in mechanical ways. But if that's true, then demanding a how explanation in relation to the mind's activity is, one may argue, a category error. Yeah, so that post influenced me a lot when I first found it. And I think it's right. I mean, I really don't see what's wrong with that. That's kind of the heart of why I don't see the interaction problem as some kind of, terribly fatal, destructive problem to substance dualism. And again, I don't think it's like a tu quoque fallacy or something like that. Yeah, I think that would be kind of an uncharitable way to understand that critique. I think there's actually a good argument there. And I think that like this kind of reliance on informal fallacies can kind of obscure good arguments and good points, because lots of good inferences superficially sound like these informal fallacies. So anyway, I've got a couple videos about why I don't like these fallacies, but anyway, I think that's a good argument. I think that, yeah, causation is basic or primitive. And if that's so, then there's not some kind of special problem between the mind and the body causally interacting with each other any more than there's a problem with physical things interacting with each other. They stand or fall together, and they both stand. So that's basically how I see it. That's basically, in a nutshell, why I don't think this is a real problem for substance dualism.
After all, isn't it clear that the reason why certain material objects affect others is material contact? But why should spatial contact have causal repercussions? The fact that spatial objects...
I will say that if I had this view of causation, of, contact mechanics, which was very common. I mean, this is like the basis of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia's critique of Descartes, even though I'll remind you, she was a disciple of his. She didn't reject dualism because of her objections. People had a certain picture of what causation was back then. And it makes some intuitive sense, but it is just not accepted by anyone in physics today, to my knowledge. It's like, yeah, I mean, like, it's an intuitively plausible view, but it hasn't held up as physics has progressed. So, yeah, if you accept some kind of contact mechanical view of causation where it has to, like, literally touch it, to, like, push it, well then, yeah, something being totally non-spatial is a big problem. But that's not how anyone views causation. So for dualists, embodiment is basically just there's a reliable set of causal connections between the mind and the body. And this causation doesn't have to take the form of like literal contact mechanics or anything.
Coming into contact routinely generates causal exchange is obvious enough, but why does it do so? Is it because of the object's mass or volume? If so, why do mass or volume have the causal liabilities and powers they do?
A.C. Ewing gives us an answer to this from the nature of relations. In the first place, a relation, if it is to be a relation at all, must unite some terms. Secondly, most if not all kinds of relation presuppose a specific common character, usually or always of the type called by Mr. Johnson a determinable in the related terms, without which the assertion of the specific relation would not be merely false but absurd. Spatial relations presuppose in this way the common determinable of extension. The relation of similarity presupposes some common determinable in the determinate value of which the objects are said to be similar. The relations of enmity or love, the common determinable of emotional capacity. The relation of causality, the common character of being events or continuance in time, and perhaps membership in some specific causal system. A relation could not be present at all if its terms were not characterized by certain determinable, and if there are determinate qualities within this and other subordinate determinables did not fall within certain limits. So the structure, how all things relate, would not exist without these shared categories of properties. All things are inherently interconnected through these properties, not just by independent objects bumping into each other. This is that unity advantage I was referring to before. As pessimistic idealism puts it, no relations can obtain between two or more determinants unless there is a qualitative commonality obtaining between them. A necessary condition for a qualitative commonality obtaining between two or more determinants is for said determinants to be of the same ontological kind. Said ontological kind being none other than that higher determinable, or genus, through which said determinants must be conceived in order for their interrelatedness to be conceivable. This entails that no relations obtain between physical and mental. And if there are no relations between mental and physical, then there are certainly no causal relations.
Okay, so this is the one argument where I think dualists have an easy response, where he's saying that they have to have some sufficient commonality in order for there to be interaction. They have to belong to some, similar genus in order for there to be this kind of causal influence between the two. And I think that they do have that. they're both concrete. They're both concrete entities. So I think that can answer this particular concern, where it's just like, oh, well, these two things are just too different. They have nothing in common. And if they have nothing in common, then they cannot interact. There are no relations between them at all. So there can't be causal relations. So I'm willing to accept that principle for the sake of argument. Like, in order for two things to stand in any kind of causal relation to each other, they have to have something in common. Okay, I'm not totally sold on that, but I'll go along with it for the sake of argument. Well, the thing they have in common is that they're both concrete. The soul and the body are both concrete objects. The soul is not an abstract object like a proposition or a number. So they do belong to a common genus. They do have something in common. They're both concrete, and this is not some kind of like revisionist view of souls. Like that's the ordinary view. If you're into philosophy of religion, you've heard William Lane Craig say, the characteristic feature of abstracta is that they're causally effete. They don't have any causal influence. Okay, well, you can question the abstract concrete distinction, but if we're just accepting it for the time being, and we're accepting that that's the difference, well, I mean, substance dualists, interactionist dualists, they do believe there's causal interaction. They do think the soul has causal effects, so they don't think it's abstract. Like the experience you're having right now, this is not like an abstract object. This is very concrete. It's the most concretely real thing there is your phenomenology right now. So yeah, the physical is concrete, the mental is concrete. That's the thing they have in common. So I don't think this argument goes through, because they do have a certain kind of commonality. They're both concrete entities. They're both substances.
So the physical and mental cannot interact. I'll be going into even more detail on this when I address Ralph Weir, but this would be what I call the more sophisticated formulation of the interaction problem that shows a direct and clear reason as to why mental and physical cannot interact.
Interaction between physical objects must also be basic and, therefore, no less mysterious than such interaction between immaterial and physical substances. If physical interaction is no less mysterious than dualist interaction, then there simply cannot be any advantage gained for physicalism by appealing to the fact that dualistic interaction is mysterious. The moral of this section is that whatever mystery surrounds the nature of basic causal interaction is a result of the nature of basic causation itself. This is why causal interaction between physical objects is ultimately no less mysterious than causal interaction between the body and the soul. And since this mystery applies to all instances of causation in general, it cannot be a problem for substance dualism in particular.
As I made clear before, it's not merely that interaction between mental and physical is mysterious. It's contradictory to the nature of relations. And even if it was about this causation being mysterious, a monist could still appeal to simplicity. If monistic causation is mysterious, then why burden ourselves with even more mystery of dualistic interaction, unless it is absolutely necessary?
I mean, I think that, in the abstract, he's right that, like, just because something is mysterious doesn't mean anything goes. X is mysterious, so why not accept Y as well? Yeah, that's true. He's right about that. But people have arguments for substance dualism. They think dualism has something going for it, like it's the best account of personal identity over time. It's the best account of our, mereological views, or it can best accommodate our the true mereological views. Zombie arguments, knowledge arguments. Like there are arguments that are, against physicalism at least, but there are some that are specifically for substance dualism. It's also the common sense view, which there's plenty of evidence from psychology to suggest that it is the common sense view. That's the sense that I get anyway, but yeah, there's some empirical support for the idea that we're naturally inclined to be substance dualists. So there are other things going for substance dualism. That's why I accept it. That's why you'd want to accept it.
I understand he argues all things are not equal with dualism versus materialism.
Yeah.
But as we all know, materialism is not the only form of monism.
True.
I am an idealistic monist, and I have responded to his objections to idealism in the comments of his video, Why Not Idealism? So unless he can convince the idealist that it is absolutely necessary to add this extra mystery, there isn't a good reason to burden ourselves with this extra mystery of dualistic causation, especially given the nature of relations. As James Ward puts it, there can be no experience of plurality, whether of beings, qualities, or events, that are absolutely disparate and disconnected. That is certain. All experience diversity implies some identity, and for the matter of that, all experienced identity some diversity. All this is so much logical commonplace. From this, it follows that to every known or knowable many, there will be some common term applicable to them all, which logically unifies them all.
Yeah, they're both concrete.
The internal contradictions of interactionism demonstrate that two fundamental types of substances cannot interact. If they did, they would interact via a shared property. However,
They're both concrete. That's their shared property.
if they share a property, then they are not separate substances at all. Either mind shares a physical property with matter, or matter shares a mental property with mind. As such, substance dualism becomes incoherent on close inspection and must be rejected.
This leads back to a question from before. Why can my mind move immediately only one particular body and no others? If the answer has something to do with the fact that it is my body and my mind, that the self is a relator that connects these two distinct things, this lands right on Ward's point. Given the nature of relations, there needs to be a common term that unifies them and relates them to the self.
And they're both concrete. I think that's the common term.
But given the ontological distinction and independence of matter and mind, they cannot be unified, so they cannot be related, and so they certainly cannot be causally related. Only a monistic reality in which everything is related by a common term can this be done.
Because my opinion is that this first premise, this idea that we know that all physical effects are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes, it is just something people have made up, and we would need good evidence that that's the case.
Based. Yeah, so do watch the whole video. I'm unfortunately running super short on time. I didn't realize how late it was already. But yeah, do watch the whole video. It's linked in the description. And what else? Oh yeah, watch that video with me and Ralph Stefan Weir, because that was a great video. And leave a comment. Leave a nice comment for a change. You ever think about that? Leaving a nice comment? And check out this Substack post from Both Sides Brigade. But yeah. Hang on, I got a couple of questions here. Is your position that the soul is concrete but doesn't have a physical location? Yes, that is my position. That's if I have my dualist hat on, which, you know, it's my second favorite view, but the more I think about personal identity, the more I'm drawn to it, because the only other alternative that can accommodate what I think is true about personal identity is, oh man, what is it called? Hedda Hasselmark has a paper about it, open individualism. That can accommodate what I think is true about personal identity, but it does require some pretty radical stuff, like we are all one. We're all one person. We are literally all the same person. Just slightly counterintuitive, but maybe more than slightly, but it can kind of maintain, I think, some of the advantages that people typically think are unique to substance dualism. But that's where I would have to go. So the more I think about personal identity, the more I'm drawn to dualism. But for this video, I've got my dualist hat on. Yeah, so that's what I think if I am a dualist. I've been here 2 minutes and I'm bored of this philosophy of mind stuff. We got to go to disrespecting the state of Israel. Yeah, and that's an imperative. And I do disrespect the state of Israel on Twitter all the time. It's actually the main preoccupation that I have right now. Is your view, in your view, is the soul the only entity that is concrete but has no location? Maybe. Yeah. Not sure if that's really a big strike against it, but yeah, I mean, consciousness is unique, so it wouldn't really surprise me if it had some unique properties. This is sort of getting at the both sides brigade post, where it's like, well, we should have high priors in physicalism because reductionist, physicalist explanations in general have worked out pretty well. And Brian Cutter has this fantastic Substack post that I reposted on Substack about this, where he's like, I'm a physicalist about most things. I'm a physicalist about, wagon wheels and lamps. I'm a physicalist about almost everything except the mind. Yeah, and that's the view of all dualists. But it's not really that surprising that this extremely unique phenomenon would have some unique properties. So yeah, there's really nothing else like consciousness. So it's just not that surprising to me that it would be unique. Have you seen Richard Brown's interview with Arnold Zuboff? Who the fuck is that? No, I don't know. About open individualism. No, I have not. I did see an interview with Richard Brown on some channel. It was called Camp something. Yeah, I don't remember, but it was a really, really interesting interview. It was like one of these Joe Rogan wannabes. But he had Richard Brown on, and it was a fantastic conversation. A lot of it was about like neuroscience and science of consciousness stuff, and I really, really enjoyed it. I do got to get Richard Brown on the channel at some point, so all you stop harassing me about my anti-physicalist bias. But anyway, I've got to go. I actually am short on time. So, short little stream today. I will talk to you later. Have a nice night.